Bob, welcome to the show. So good to have you. What an honor.
Well, thank you, Clint. I appreciate for you bringing me on, and heard lots of good things about you too. So here we are, man.
Here we are. Here we are. So, how about you tell us a little bit about your background with Franz Bardon?
Sure. Like a lot of people, I trained for years in other systems before I found out about Bardon. Pretty common for a lot of Western practitioners, and I've talked about that in other places. So people can largely know about that. But I made the rounds of the Tibetan Buddhist stuff, Tantric Buddhist stuff, Taoism, internal martial arts, a few Hindu yogic systems, pretty much everything, and had a lot of really good experiences. The ultimate problem was none of it was well organized. So I experienced all these energies, I had all these kind of phenomenon happen, but I didn't really know why they happened or how they fit together. Finally, around 2014, uh, Mark Rasmus held a seminar near the town that I lived in. Now, I live in a fairly remote area of the Mid Atlantic, so that was really weird. That was like lightning striking, right? Who shows up out here? Um, I had a habit of crashing the rare events like that happen in my area because a lot of these yogi guys are up to no good. And I figured, all right, if this is some weird cult leader, I'm just going to send him packing and that's going to be it. Showed up. Mark was a wonderful man, a very nice individual, easy to work with. And at the end of it, I said, hey, I'm getting out of the military soon. Why don't I come visit you in Thailand? He's like, yeah, sure, man. We'll have a good time. And so I started training with Mark. And Mark's training is heavily grounded in the works of Franz Bardon. Now, I had tried reading Bardon's book by myself prior to meeting Mark on a number of occasions and couldn't quite make heads or tails of it. The way he outlines things aren't quite modern. They're not really like a bullet point type thing. Do A, B happens kind of deal. So when I met Mark, um, he spent about half his time giving me a vocabulary, going, this is vital, this is astral, this is mental, how they were specifically generated, and how they fit together. And that in turn allowed me to make a lot of sense of the training that I'd done. So I could go, okay, when this happened, it was an astral phenomenon. When this happened, this was working with the electric or magnetic lines of force. And that allowed me to progress very, very quickly. So fast forward 9 years, and basically I'd say 80 to 85% of what I do is now a derivative of Franz Bardon's work, and about 15% is the stuff that I learned previously, mainly falling into the areas of things like pranayama and breath retention, because those topics aren't really covered any real degree in Bardon's first book. So that's kind of where I came from. I lost I lost your audio there, but
Oh, I had it muted because my dog was making noise. Yeah, that's awesome. That's fantastic. Yeah. So you've done so much work yourself to help people with all of this kind of material. What would you like to highlight about some of the work you've done online?
I would say Kabbalistic letter theory is probably my main focus. And the people have this strange idea that it's not accessible, or it's something where you have to practice 20 years before you can work with letters. If you do a careful reading of Bardon's first book, he's teaching you the mother letters as the elements. And so people need to be less afraid of that. From what I found in Bardon's first book, equilibrium and working with the letters are the primary power generation method that he has in there as well. So it's really important. The nice thing about it is when you're using three-part concentration, color, sound, sensation, well, you're also training the level 1 exercises at the same time. You're also training the visualization exercises at the same time. Now, you still have to revisit those things and build ability at it, but I like working with the letters because it allows me to work on so many different things at a high level of intensity at the same time. And to be honest with you, it's the letters where magic really becomes practical. You know, enlightenment, breaking through to non-dual light, divine providence. There's any number of ways to do this. Lots of systems do that. Truthfully, it doesn't take much more than a year or two. But learning to apply this stuff is a lot like becoming a good chef or a good carpenter. You know, there's just hundreds of hours of beating the hammer and putting the nail in to where you get to the point where you can just put the nail on the piece of wood and go bonk and it goes right in. And that's how I liken a lot of the training with the letters. And because the third book was incomplete in so many different ways, and there's so few practitioners of that system, that's why I like working with them. Now, the interesting part is since I released my book a couple of years ago, I've had about half a dozen conversations with people who train the letters outside the Franz Bardon nexus. These are mainly Hindu yogic practitioners who called me and said, hey, this is what we do. So that's the reason why I really view that as more of a universal technology, with the caveat that not everybody needs to be able to drive a car at the level of a Formula One race car driver. Yeah. Maybe you just need to be able to drive a car like a high school bus driver. You know, it really depends on what you're doing. And so the letters give you a tremendous degree of flexibility. And they're relatively safe as long as you keep in mind the issue of counterbalance, you know, not too much fire without enough water and so on and so forth. And they're largely devoid of any kind of mental influence that you get from working with the spirit beings from various sources. So I found for a lot of my students, the letters are really where the rubber hits the road, and it's what they really enjoy.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, just for me to be clear, with all the letter stuff, did you ever train with other teachers, or is this kind of something after Mark you just kind of basically went through on your own?
I had trained with other teachers, but I didn't know what I was training. That was the problem. So in a lot of schools you run into out there, they teach you the elements, whether that's a 4-element system or a 5-element system, what have you. But they never bother to explain what to do with it. So it makes it very confusing. You know, you spend a lot of time saying Shingi, right? 5-element fist, working fire element, working water element, all that. But other than using it for a punch, they don't really explain what else you can use it for. So for a lot of people in these other systems, you know, say Golden Dawn, you know, the invoking rituals of the pentagram for all the different elements, it's there, and that's how you would build skill at something like that. But they never bother to explain individually what to do with it. So my Taoist teacher taught me a 5-element system that involved posture holding, and you had to do 2 hours per element. I mean, you were putting this huge amount of effort into it, and it was really potent and worked really well. But again, I had no idea what to do with it once I got to the other side. And part of this, I think, is when I've seen teachers with high level of ability teach, they kind of end up clumping their students into 3 categories. One, you've got the people who can't do it at all. So they just do the waving hand stuff or the Tai Chi form because they can't feel the energy. They don't have any clairvoyance. They don't have any clairaudience. Yeah, for them, it's exercise. Okay. Then they break into a second group where you end up with people like me who can feel the energy. So that's good. You know, now you can work with the internal aspect of what's going on. But unfortunately, my native clairvoyance and clairaudience aren't very good. I had to work really hard for a really long period of time to get any of that. So with a lot of my teachers, it got to a point where then they kicked me out because they were naturally clairvoyant. So they could do all the energy work, make contact with some various entity who could then explain to them what to do with it. With a lot of people like myself, we can feel the energy and we might get a lot of intuition, but we never hear the voice and we never see the thing. And they cut those people loose and then just focus on those folks who have a high degree of natural clairvoyance or clairaudience. The brilliance of Bardon's work is they give us a method by which to develop those things that a very small number of people can do naturally. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm such a fan of the system. Did that make sense, or did I kind of wander off track with that?
Oh no, that completely made sense. That was a great answer. It's all really good to hear. Yeah, an odd thing kind of came to mind. How does the letter of theory and the key to the true Kabbalah relate to like Sanskrit?
Actually, really well. Um, see, the thing is if you look at the energies of Bardon's Kabbalah, this is kind of the foundation of the universe. It's what everything exists out of. So they're universal in terms of the fact that anybody can work with. When you deal with stuff like Sanskrit, you generate a very large egregoric aspect because these things have been around for thousands of years. So the energetic reservoir and buildup around it are really strong. You get into that with things like a lot of the Golden Dawn work as well, right? You're still talking about fire, but it feels a little different because there's this other thing around it. On the one hand, it makes it very easy to work with because it's got this huge reservoir that as a new person you can draw on. And this is one of the major ways by which ritual magic writ large works. One of my students, who is fluent in several difficult Asian languages, did an experiment where he would take a Sanskrit letter or one of the older kanji or one of the older characters from Chinese for a given thing like fire. Use the ball above head method, picture that character above his head, and guess what? It generated the power of a letter. Now, it was a little different, okay? And keep in mind, he'd done a lot of work with single-pointed focus and his visualization skills and all, building the ball so he had clear sentience. I mean, he wasn't just some guy wandering off the street with a good idea. But what we found was that you can use things like characters or symbols just in the same way you use sigils using the ball above head method, and it works just fine. And now, again, the disadvantage being is that Bardon's system is largely clean of any kind of egregoric or power reservoir buildup influence. If you're going to use a Sanskrit letter, if you're going to use the Chinese character for clairvoyance, which is like something like, translates something like 1,000-mile eye, because these are very old and people have been working with these for a very long period of time, you're going to get a bunch of other stuff with that as well. That isn't necessarily bad, but it is something that you have to keep in mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I'm almost wondering your take. If the energetic reservoir, I totally get that with Sanskrit and have experienced that myself with Sanskrit and with mantras and stuff. But if you're saying the energetic reservoir with Bardon isn't very built up, I mean, what's your notion of perhaps ascended masters or like a lineage that came in Bardon's line before him?
I think Bardon was a very gifted medium. This is going to be a bit of heresy out there. Okay? What little we know about his personal practice was that he did a lot of alchemy. He got rolled up by the Czech police for home brewing his own alcohol and not paying his taxes on it so he could make spagyrics. Okay. From the little bit that's dribbled out regarding information on his private practice group, there was a lot of stuff related to more traditional Western European hermetics in there. Now, I'm not going to say Golden Dawn practice, but a lot of the symbology he used and a lot of the other things like that, he clearly had. He was also very clearly a naturally gifted clairvoyant and clairaudient. And so when I look at the books that he wrote, I look at things like the first book. And I see, okay, what this really looks like to me was a series of letters he wrote to students he'd already trained, just as kind of a reminder of what their training consisted of and to highlight certain points versus something that was built as a piece of standalone training that somebody then compiled. I look at the second book and I go, okay, this is clearly the guy's private practice. He was really into spirit evocation, these hundreds of sigils, many of which you can't find anywhere else. He clearly did the path working on all of that. And he had to have a high level of clairvoyance and clairaudience to get the detailed information on the entities that he did. Because again, if it was some entity that someone else had heard of, fine, you rip it out of the book. But a lot of the creatures in there, we never heard of. So he clearly did that. The third book, I look at that, and the training methodology it puts forth for the single letter key, by the way, is excellent. Really good. Everybody should follow it, and everyone I know who has done really, really good. I get into the 2-letter key, and I'm like, okay, this is all largely accurate, but there are a few things in here that are disconnects that don't make sense. Now, is this because the book was never really properly written and maybe his secretary just took a bunch of notes after he died and went, hey, we're grateful for what we get, right? But that glyph on the front page of the third book, okay, this is taken from several traditional schools of Jewish Kabbalah use, where he just stripped the characters off the front of it. So the geometry, the colors, all that same stuff, if you look in the right places, just missing the Hebrew characters. All right, that's a little curious. And then there's a bunch of things involving 4-letter practice that don't get explained in terms of importance, that come across as really weird. About how you can generate, that 16 character chart they've got in the back of the book with, the elements and the level of reality. Well, if you run them up to down, you get equilibrium. If you run them horizontally, I'm getting back. So you run it horizontally, you get equilibrium. If you run it down, you can generate high levels of vital, astral, and mental force. That's incredibly valuable. Why isn't that explained anywhere in the book? That makes no sense. Also, the work I've been doing over the last year, working with the Kabbalistic spirits at the planetary level and now at the zodiac level and getting into the Sephiroth, if you do a careful reading of the second book, this is highly alluded to in some of the spirits, particularly the ones in the 360 zones of the near Earth region. Why isn't any of that mentioned in the third book when you're looking at that glyph on the front page, and that's clearly what it's describing? So how much of the third book Bardon actually did versus how much he channeled, I think is a legitimate question. And I know that's hearsay in the Bardon community. I'm going to get lots of hate and all that other kind of stuff, but that's kind of what I see in terms of the meta system, Clint. And as unfortunately he died early and all of his writings were lost and all this other kind of thing, and none of his students are apparently talking. So we don't really know how the rest of that was supposed to fit together. But when I look at the 3 books, those are the kinds of questions that enter my mind regarding how these things fit together and what Bardon did as a man, not necessarily as a teacher.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind is with these 3 books, I run across a lot of students that almost want to work the second or go on to the third before having completed the first initiation into hermetics. I mean, what's your best advice about, an initiation to hermetics? Bardon's very clear. Oh, don't go on to the next step till you finish this one. Like, as far as the books go and all these practices go, do you think a specific order is absolutely necessary or can be played with a little bit?
I think there's a lot more flexibility there than most people would want to get into. You got to remember that when Bardon's first book was released, he was in this hangover period after World War II. You know, he'd been in a concentration camp. The Nazi Party had had a definite interest in esoteric and clearly pursued a lot of esoteric practitioners. How much they did with that, who really knows, but they clearly had an interest. And he was wanting to protect what he'd written from people who had, let's call it, negative intentions. And a good way of doing that is to make it appear to be a higher bar for success than it really is. As a practical matter, if someone has basic concentration skills, can feel energy via an exercise like Build the Bar, can do the electric and magnetic lines of force, they can actually work with Kabbalah very well. And I say that because I've seen this in internal martial arts schools. Now, these aren't complete systems, don't get me wrong there, all right, but they'll learn how to generate one or two different forces really strongly so they can punch harder or take a hit. They don't have any clairvoyance, they don't have any clairaudience at all, and it works just fine. Now, you're going to be limited in what you can do with that, obviously, but you can still practice it. When it comes to the second book, I caution people. I go, listen, if you look at conventional evocation, this is a game most people lose. Because if you don't have access to your own Akasha, and preferably divine providence or non-dual light, it's a battle of willpower with an entity that never sleeps. And you're going to lose that battle, which is why a lot of these guys into like the Megaton and all this, you know, the 72 spirits of Galatia have this weird vibe around them and nobody wants to deal with those guys. Once you have access to your own Akasha and non-dual light, the Akasha allows you to dissolve the subtle body of the entity so they then respect you. And the non-dual light, in theory anyway, makes you track along your personal line of development. No guarantee that's going to happen, but that's generally the way it works. So if you have those two things by themselves, no matter where you got them from, as long as you're cognizant of spiritual hygiene, you know, and careful with brushing your teeth and wearing clean clothes when you do an evocation and not having done a bunch of drugs or other weird things right beforehand, your odds of invoking a negative entity are pretty low. Bardon's book is good in that the entities are largely neutral or beneficent in nature. So your odds of invoking a negative spirit until you get to the Saturn spirits, relatively low. So is it ideal for someone to have the complete toolkit before they get started? Yes. I will make one other caveat. What I found is that if you can get through most of the first book, go to the third book first. Learn Kabbalah first. Then do evocation. The spirits treat you very, very, very differently if you can work with the letters. And this is my theory as to that. If you go to a spirit to learn how to do something, like develop healing hands, right? If you can't do the letters, your ability to identify the energy being used isn't that good, generally speaking. So every time you want to do healing hands, you have to call on the entity and it comes down and goes bang. But if you learn how to work with the letters first, you can invoke the entity, it can show you how to do something, and then you can do it on your own. So there's not that dependency with the entity anymore. It's more of an instructional relationship. The result of which is I found they tend to treat people very differently. And most interestingly, I had an interview with John Michael Greer several years ago. And he was very clear about this. He said the purpose of the rituals and ritual magic is to teach you how to work with the energies so you don't need the rituals anymore. But he's the only person from that lineage I've ever met who ever got to that. So, interesting data.
Yeah, that last caveat you said all resonates with me very strongly. And yeah, I've often wondered why not switch the order of the third and second book.
the main thing is, talking to Mark about this, he thinks there's about 300 or 400 people, regardless of tradition worldwide, who do letter work the way we do it. So a big problem is the instruction base is a little thin, to be kind. Also, I've seen people make some mistakes with the third book where they weren't careful with counterbalancing, so they ended up hurting themselves. If they did way too much fire energy and never bothered to work. Or they didn't really understand the importance of equilibrium. Or, they just got through the first letter key, but they couldn't make sense of that chart in the back of the book involving, the 4-letter combinations and why that's important. So if you have a teacher, it's great. If you're willing to be patient and work with the third book carefully, that works fine too. But much like the martial arts schools I mentioned, who are essentially doing Kabbalah, although not really doing it comprehensively, I've seen single-pointed focus with certain energies to result in some really weird personality and health disorders over time. But again, hey man, if it's 750 AD in central China and everything's bananas and you got to get your power on now because the bandits are coming in 6 months, hey brother, do what you got to do,
Yeah, this is all fantastic stuff. And the idea of going patiently through the third book, how difficult do you think it would be for a solitary practitioner to actually kind of do that? Because I'm almost wondering, if there's not many people that teach the letter theory, there's probably not many people asking for it either. Am I right?
Very few, which is sad because to the degree magic exists in the world, this is it. This is as magic as you're going to get. But it's such an arcane topic, nobody knows what they're looking for. It's like the guys you meet in an internal martial arts class who really want to learn magic, but they don't know what they're looking for. So they spend years monkeying around with Tai Chi forms or whatever. And then they finally need somebody who understands the other side of it, and they dump the martial practice and they just focus on it. That's the problem with letter practice and getting people to do it. Is it's ultimately what a lot of people want, they just don't know what it is. Now, what I will say is you can easily work through the first letter key in a year, easily. Do the build out exactly the way Franz Bardon describes it. That takes you about maybe 6 months max. Assuming, again, you can focus and you have the electric and magnetic lines of force and you can feel energy and you can do those 3 things. Then I would spend a week with each letter going from A to Z with one change, in that you do the letter U last. The letter U is the last letter in the series. It's one of those things that got mixed up in the book or left out, actually. Because it represents universal caution. And by a week's worth of practice, I mean 2 hours in the morning, run the letter in the background for the rest of the day. Every week, rinse, repeat. So in about a year, by yourself, someone could easily get through the series and probably be okay. There'd be some times where the personality gets a little weird because they're doing too many fire letters or too many water letters in a series, and that the fire, air, water, earth, akasha series isn't perfect within the 27 letters the way they're spelled out. So you're gonna have some issues there, but pretty dealable in general. The only caveat to that I'm going to mention is that your ability to generate the letters energetically with great strength has a very big relation to the amount of astral energy you can draw. And this has a big relationship in general in most people to the amount of body training they've done. The stronger those electric and magnetic lines of force are, the more deeply the energy can penetrate. And body training is definitely a weakness in Bardon's first book.
Okay, okay, got it. Well, just out of curiosity, what are your daily practices now, like at this point?
I am a bad example of an old fart. Okay. I did all this tremendous physical work when I was younger, so I was able to build those connections into my body, and that allows me to get away with a lot of things that somebody starting from zero would not be able to. That said, most of my personal practice consists of Kabbalistic letter practice, usually about half an hour with that, with one thing or another that I'm working at the time. And then whatever I'm focusing on for the day for another hour or so. Usually, like right now, it's been the Zodiac series. We're about to wrap that up and hit the Set Growth series. So I'm spending about an hour a day working on Leo right now in the associated Kabbalistic spirit for Leo. Then there'll usually be some body training depending upon how wiped out I am physically, just because it's good exercise. So I would say probably all in 2 hours a day is pretty manageable. And on that note, I've known people who've made excellent progress having a disciplined practice of 2 hours a day. Guys who were just machines who were like, all right, it's 4:30 in the morning, get up 4:30 to 6:30, take a shower, get ready for work, go on about their day. And consistency and journaling are the key right there.
Oh, that's interesting. Could you tell us some more about journaling?
Absolutely. Where journaling becomes crucial is you're going to have these breakthroughs when you practice, right? But your mind doesn't like that. Your mind likes consistency. Your mind likes everything to always be the same. It's like your dog, right? If your dog could have the same day every day, that's perfect and it does. That's how your mind works. So when you have these breakthroughs, if you don't write it down, in most cases, your mind is going to paper that over and you'll simply forget. So one of the best learning tools I have is to get people to journal. And that's where my whole third book, my whole book that I wrote came from, because I'd been very stubborn about this and hadn't wanted to journal, and Mark had yelled at me a bunch of times. And then for whatever reason, I did it when I built out the letters and was like, holy crap, I got a book. So the advantage of writing things down in your own hand is that when your mind papers over what you went through and you've forgotten the high point of whatever happened and how to do it, when you go back a week later and you reread that, you can't argue with yourself. It's not the teacher yelling at you going, hey, this happened, get on it. You wrote it down. And then it's like, oh, that did happen. And I prefer, a written medium for this too, because the pages take on a power that an electronic medium doesn't seem to hold. So I can go back and read something and be like, all this other information will kind of come through with it as well. That isn't just in the written words. So the students that I've had that are very disciplined in their practice, in terms of routine, have a routine they follow no matter what happens. And the ones who journal by far do the best. And my best student out there, we met online. He sent me an email. He was living in Asia, kind of screwing around. And he wanted to come visit with me. And I was like, listen, I live in the States. This is going to be really expensive, blah, 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 blah. What are you doing for a living? And he told me. And I was like, all right, you need to go see Mark. And Mark Rasmus was running basically a temple in this one country in Southeast Asia at the time. And the students spent 6 months there. Fast forward 4 years, what took me 30 years to do, he did in 4. Just by being disciplined and keeping at it. And having good instruction. We talk several times a week as well, or I can get into the corners and another. But the idea that it takes a lifetime to work through the 3 books is just complete and utter nonsense. If you're really disciplined and you really stay on it, 3 to 4 years seems to be about right. And this is not an individual who has very gifted clairvoyance or clairaudience. He really had to work hard. So if you look at the ancient yogic and Buddhist universities in India, your stay there was about 3 to 4 years. So in a perfectly structured environment where you're structured and you've got good mentors and all that other kind of stuff, and you have a clean methodology that's well laid out, yeah, I see no reason why 3 to 4 years isn't adequate. You could probably do it in half that time if the student were both disciplined and willing to listen to you, which, sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't.
That's yeah, that's very encouraging. Yeah, so I mean, I guess before we wrap things up here, this has been a fantastic, just fantastic stuff you're sharing, Bob. Like, thank you so much. Yeah. And where you do talk about students, could you, I don't know, people are probably curious, a rundown of all the stuff you're offering basically online.
Sure. If you go to 60skills.com, that's where all my stuff is at. The coursework is hosted by Perseus Arcane Academy. Great company to deal with, by the way, if you want to run a course. And starting August 27th, we'll be doing a new series, Meditations on the Zodiac. And this will be done in such a way that anybody can do it as long as they can sit still and they can hold a picture of a symbol above their head. You don't need any other training. And what this is this is a reconstruction of the trials of Hercules from ancient Greece. This was one of their major developmental pathways back then. It's largely a mental level series of meditations, so it's relatively easy to do. And we'll go through the whole series in a 13-week period. And then, of course, it's up to the individual to go practice on their own over the intervening year. But for what it's worth, I think this is one of the reasons why Buddhism penetrated as deeply as it did with the ancient Greeks, particularly in the eastern half of the empire. But that is a longer discussion. But the series does start on the 27th of August. And if you go to the events portion of 60skills.com, you can read up all about it. And of course, there's the YouTube channel as well, where you can listen to my various ponderings on one thing or another. But that's it, man.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, it's been so good having you on, man. Yeah, like such an honor too. And hope to have you back also.
Anytime. Anytime at all. Not a
Uh,
problem.
yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Bob.
No worries, man. Cheers.
Take care.